Welcome to the Hedberg Public Library. Thank you all for coming out tonight for our program, for our Badger Talks program, How the Ho-Chunk Resisted Removal with Stephen Kantrowitz. Stephen Kantrowitz is the Plaenert-Bascom Professor of History at University of Wisconsin-Madison. He was born in Boston, earned his PhD at Princeton, and has been teaching at Madison since 1995. Professor Kantrowitz writes and teaches about race, politics, citizenship, and native settler interaction in the 19th century United States. He is the author or editor of 4 books and has received numerous awards for his scholarship and teaching. Tonight, he will be talking about the topic of his most recent book, Citizens of a Stolen Land, A Ho-Chunk History of the 19th Century United States. Please welcome Professor Stephen Kantrowitz.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you all for coming. What a great turnout. It's nice to see you all here tonight. As Mary said, this talk is based on my recent book, came out last year, Citizens of a Stolen Land. And this is the story of the Ho-Chunk encounter with the United States. Really a very, very tiny fraction of Ho-Chunk history, but a really crucial one for their modern history because it reforged their relationship to the land that they call home and to the terms on which they could continue to occupy it. The terms of that are really pretty stark, and some of you are no doubt familiar with them, but let me begin at the beginning. Between 1828 and 1837, the United States coerced the Ho-Chunk people into signing a series of treaties that stripped them of title to their entire ancestral homeland. Over the next 40 years, the United States government repeatedly expelled the Ho-Chunk people to new homelands and reservations west of the Mississippi River. Despite this, and despite the enormous human cost, the thousands of lives lost over these forced migrations, the Ho-Chunk people continue to live in large parts of their ancestral homeland, and many are members of the Ho-Chunk Nation of Wisconsin. And this raises a question. How did their ancestors defy the sustained policy of removal, as the federal government called it? And how did they reestablish a legal claim to reside here, to own land here, and to be a sovereign nation here? Now, I'm a historian, and I was trained as a historian of the 19th century United States. So the answers that I initially sought to that question were in the same places I always sought them, in the archive, in the library. But in the course of this investigation over the last 10 years or so, really, I've also come into contact and into relationship with Ho-Chunk people in a variety of contexts, especially in Madison, in Dejope, 4 Lakes, and on the UW-Madison campus. And today's Ho-Chunk people have taught me to think of themselves and their lives in a more expansive way than simply this history of colonial dispossession and conquest. 200 years ago, not very long ago, Ho-Chunk was the primary language of the territory that we literally are standing on tonight. It was the primary language here. If you were moving through along the Rock River here and you encountered somebody and wanted to speak to them, the first language you would try would be Ho-Chunk. If that failed, you might try another native language, depending on your assessment of who they were, perhaps an Anishinaabe language, Potawatomi, or perhaps Menominee, or perhaps Ojibwe. If those failed, you might try French. English might not occur to you, right? In that world, about 4,500 Ho-Chunk people lived in about 40 distinct bands, which occupied seasonal and sometimes year-round villages in which they made use of local resources. It would get together on hunting parties and for feasts and other ceremonies, maintained kinship relationships across these village bands, and of course clanship relationships. Every Ho-Chunk person is born into one of 12 patrilineal clans, and that clan says a great deal about what the person's responsibility are to the community and what their duties are as a citizen, if you want, of the Ho-Chunk world. The Ho-Chunk homeland, as you can see sketched out by the Ho-Chunk Department of Cultural Resources here in red, is quite extensive, covering a very large area of the Western Great Lakes, and including areas that were also occupied by other native nations. And in fact, some Ho-Chunk villages were multi-tribal, in which both Ho-Chunk, say, and Potawatomi people would live together or close to one another. But by the time the United States arrived in force in the region in the 1820s, its first action in the Treaty of Prairie du Chien in 1825 was to get those native nations to agree in principle which territories belonged to whom, as though they were European nation states and could define their borders in that hard way. And according to the terms of that treaty in 1825, this green area here was the U.S. recognized homeland of the Ho-Chunk people. As you can see, a significantly smaller area than the one that the Ho-Chunk thought of as their homeland, and in which they traveled and farmed and hunted and did many other things. As soon as the United States recognized this as the treaty homeland of the Ho-Chunk people, its settlers, squatters, began to invade its territory and try to plunder its resources, especially lead, the strategic military commodity of the early 19th century. This was a story of, really a very ugly story of vigilante gangs of squatters invading the territory in force, coming into conflict with Ho-Chunk people, calling on the United States for assistance. The United States Army arrives under color of maintaining the peace, inevitably, almost always ends up siding with the settlers or squatters rather than the Ho-Chunk, and forcing the Ho-Chunk into a series of treaties in which they cede ever greater proportions of their homeland to the United States. It is a story of colonial dispossession by force. The leader of that is someone whose name you probably know. We know Henry Dodge maybe best as the territorial governor of Wisconsin, as a leading political figure, as a statesman of Wisconsin, but before that, he'd been a sheriff in the Missouri territory. He'd been a slaveholder who illegally brought enslaved people into the Wisconsin territory in the 1820s. He was a squatter on Ho-Chunk land and the leader of a vigilante army in Ho-Chunk territory in the 1820s. The provocateur who brings what the U.S. comes to call the Winnebago War in 1827, which becomes the basis for a massive U.S. military presence in the Ho-Chunk homeland and the demand that the Ho-Chunk cede a huge fraction of that territory to the United States. And that's what happens in the Treaty of 1829. The United States essentially forces the Ho-Chunk to sign a treaty that ratifies Henry Dodge and his friends' theft of the Ho-Chunk's lead diggings by ceding a third of the territory that they had recognized, the U.S. had recognized just 4 years earlier as the homeland of the Ho-Chunk people. Just 3 years later, it happens again. And you also know that story because it's the story we know as the Black Hawk War, in which another band of native people, not Ho-Chunk, but Sauk and of other nations, return from their exile across the Mississippi River into their old farmlands in Illinois. Settlers object, and the Illinois militia chases them north into the Michigan Territory, what we now know as Wisconsin, and into the Ho-Chunk homeland. Much of the violence of the Black Hawk War takes place, in fact, in the Ho-Chunk homeland. And during that struggle, the Ho-Chunk people are desperate to keep violence from occurring between the United States and its forces and Black Hawk's band. because the Ho-Chunk people understand that if that battle occurs on their territory, that will bring a massive army of occupation, and at the end of that, the Ho-Chunk will be forced to cede more territory. So they try desperately to keep the peace, to keep Black Hawk's band separated from and sheltered from the American forces pursuing them, and it almost works. But as we know, it doesn't. Black Hawk's band is identified, pursued, and massacred. And at the end of the war, with a presence of thousands of U.S. troops on the ground in the Ho-Chunk homeland, the United States treaty commissioners call Ho-Chunk leaders to another treaty council in which they force them to cede another third of the territory that had been assigned to them in 1825. The treaty commissioners could not be more frank about what they're doing. In their notes back home to Washington, they write that this treaty is made on the blended grounds of conquest and contract. It's on this basis that just 4 years later, this part of the Michigan Territory is established as the territory of Wisconsin, a U.S. federal territory. And if we look carefully at the way that Henry Dodge and his nascent territorial government wanted to represent themselves, we can see the edifice of a modern society, as Americans of the day would have understood it, with institutional life and lighthouses and steamships and sailing ships, the latest technology. At the center, foregrounded, the white farmer with his plow, bringing cultivation of the soil in the American mode to this territory and reaping the bounty of these fertile fields of the Midwest. But in the middle of the frame, we can see the cost of this, which is the lone, crudely drawn native figure being pressed west, presumably across the Mississippi River, out of the Wisconsin Territory. And to put too fine a point on it, the motto of the territory makes this transition explicit. Civilitas successit barbarum. Civilization takes the place of barbarism. This was how the United States and its settlers understood their project and articulated their project. They were civilization, and the people they were replacing and supplanting were the barbarians whose order needed to give way before the American order. Wisconsin is not the only place this is happening in the 1830s, of course, and this is part of a larger process that scholars now sometimes call settler colonialism. In the 19th century, in this context, it was called Indian removal. Better perhaps described not as removal, which in the 19th century had connotations of a vacation, in fact, but as dispossession and exile and frequently extermination, ethnic cleansing. The Ho-Chunk story is part of this larger story. The most famous story, of course, of Indian removal is the Cherokee Trail of Tears, but that story is replicated over and over again in many other tribal contexts. Not all of them even identified on this map, but this gives you a sense of the extent of this policy and its impact on Native communities all across a wide swath of the Mississippi territories of the United States. 5 years later, it happens again. By 1837, the settlers of the Wisconsin Territory had decided that they wanted the Ho-Chunk to be expelled fully from their territory and forced a treaty upon, very, very crudely, forced a treaty upon the Ho-Chunk remaining in Wisconsin, that they would leave the territory of Wisconsin and accept exile west of the Mississippi in a place called the Neutral Ground, understood to be a temporary place of residence for them, not a comfortable place for them because it put them between the Dakota and the Ojibwe, who were intermittently at war with one another, and also between just in a very unpleasant social situation with a great deal of hardship inflicted upon them as the federal government forced them into camps on the Mississippi River and then across the river itself into this new territory. The human crisis in the Neutral Ground is extensive, and the threat to Ho-Chunk survival is significant. And in this moment, we watch the beginnings of two responses to this challenge to Ho-Chunk ways of being and existence. I've embodied them in two men here. This is a heuristic. This is not the whole history itself, but this will do as a way of explaining some of the distinctions. On the left, a figure I will come back to later in my talk called Wakanja Hedega, Roaring Thunder, a civil chief. And on the right, Wakanja Guga, Coming Thunder Winishek. Both of them understood to be leaders of Ho-Chunk bands, and in the case of Coming Thunder Winishek, also sort of anointed by the federal government as principal chief of the Ho-Chunk, a title that he intermittently used when he found it useful. And they represent two great strains in the Ho-Chunk response to the American pressures on them. Coming Thunder Winishek pursues a policy of pushing back against the Americans' depredations while trying to lead his people to some form of safety and security in these territories west of the Mississippi River. Roaring Thunder, on the other hand, refuses to leave the Wisconsin Territory. And he and maybe 40% of the Ho-Chunk people simply refuse to stay gone or refuse to leave at all. They never leave the territory, and they find other ways to live here in and around the emerging settler grid. I'll come back to them in a minute. For the moment, I want to follow what happens to the people who do end up in the exile communities, in the exile diaspora of the Ho-Chunk people, and to follow what happens to Coming Thunder Winishek and the people like him. Because the policy of Indian removal, as the federal government imagined it, wasn't just a policy of expulsion, it was also a policy of cultural transformation. It was a policy that imagined that Native people ultimately would not just have to move west, but would have to be transformed into a different kind of people in order to survive in and among American settlers. And therefore, they would have to take up all kinds of attributes of what Americans called, and what the Wisconsin Territorial Seal called, civilization. The kinds of farming practiced by Americans, the kinds of dwellings that Americans typically occupied, the kinds of social and gender and family relations of marriage and of work and of responsibility that the Americans found familiar, all of which were quite different than Ho-Chunk ways of being and living and relating to one another. And part of the policy of civilization was also insisting that Native people accept both land ownership under the American model, individual plots of land called allotments or homesteads, and also all of the property relations and legal relations that went along with those. In fact, the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which set the whole policy of removal into action, imagined an alternative for Native people who refused to accept removal, and that was that they would fall under the laws of the states in which they were then residing. They would no longer be recognized as people under a treaty with the US, but instead would fall under state laws. And this sounds like a kind of a good deal, a kind of benevolent incorporation, until you realize that almost every American state's state laws in the 19th century were racially discriminatory. And that Native people who accepted American law would accept an inferior and sometimes almost powerless status under American law, where they could not sue, they could not make contracts, they could not enforce those contracts, they could not testify in court, et cetera, et cetera. All things that make property relations completely insecure. But accepting allotment, accepting citizenship in the United States did bring one thing. And for this reason, it was an attractive possibility to some people. It brought the right to remain, the right not to be expelled from the land that you occupied, not to be removed to an alien territory. And for some people, as bad a deal as that was, it seemed the best of bad options. For Coming Thunder Winishek and his people, confronting both exile and an American policy that sought to transform them culturally, the next decades were very difficult. First, they were expelled from the neutral ground to a reservation in central Minnesota Territory, a place called Long Prairie, which they found very unfamiliar and whose resources they did not find sufficient. During that period, they continued to refuse American efforts to corral them into fixed plots of land, to force their children into schools, and to do all the other things that the policy of civilization imagined. And in fact, they were so successful in refusing these policies that by the 1850s, the federal government was tired of fighting with them about it and agreed to let them make a transfer from that reservation they didn't like to lands that they preferred at a place in southern Minnesota called Blue Earth. This was a great victory in some ways because it moved them into a landscape much more like the landscape they were familiar with in Wisconsin, but it came at an enormous price. The price of it was a new treaty, a treaty of 1855, and then another treaty in 1859 that formalized the requirement that they accept allotments of land and the abolishment of their common title to commonly held land. So this deal for better lands also carried with it the seeds of a really corrosive set of legal and property practices that would threaten to dismantle their society together. Coming Thunder Wineshek was still a leader of his people in 1855 here on the Blue Earth lands and resisting the policy of allotment and the policy of civilization and the policy of citizenship. Not every Native person coming out of the Wisconsin experience in the 1830s and 40s took that position. And in fact, two groups of Native people in Wisconsin, the Stockbridge, Munsee Band of Mohican Indians and the Brothertown Nation, both looked at the oncoming flood of American settlers and the danger to their collective lives as a people and said that the best deal that they could make was to accept citizenship in the United States, privately held land, and use that private ownership land and that citizenship in the United States as a buffer against settlers' ambitions against their land. And so this was actually recognized in Wisconsin's 1848 Constitution, in which several classes of Indian people, as the Constitution called them, were recognized as citizens or voters of the state of Wisconsin on the basis of their having accepted this policy of civilization and citizenship. But Coming Thunder Wineshek did not. And in the late 1850s and early 1860s, the federal government tried to force the Ho-Chunk to make good on their promises in the earlier treaties to accept allotment and sent census takers and surveyors to the Blue Earth lands to take account of the people and get their names and the number of households and to survey the lands and decide which land belonged to whom. In other words, to dissolve the commonly held domain of the Ho-Chunk people and turn it into private plots of land. A very different way of life, and one that Coming Thunder Wineshek would not and could not accept. When the census taker came to the Ho-Chunk lands at Blue Earth and tried to get all the Ho-Chunk people to come inside the Indian Agency stockade to be counted one by one, Coming Thunder and his allies went among those people and shouted at them and remonstrated with them and pushed them back out of the stockade. And the census was foiled. They didn't get a good census of the Ho-Chunk people. They didn't know how many people they were dealing with. When the surveyors arrived to survey the Blue Earth lands off into individual allotments, Coming Thunder Wineshek grabbed the surveyor's stake and threatened to stick him with it unless he left the reservation. The delaying action works. When the Civil War breaks out in 1861, the lands still have not been surveyed. Only a few people have been allotted. A very small fraction of the Ho-Chunk people of Blue Earth had taken allotment by then. And it looked as though perhaps the delaying action could go on indefinitely, except that the Ho-Chunk were not the only Native people who had been forced into a reservation in southern Minnesota. So too had been the people whose land this had primarily been for generations, the Dakota people, who, having formerly occupied nearly the entire territory, by the 1850s were on this tiny strip of land along the Minnesota River. And in 1862, facing starvation and great frustration at their treatment at the hands of the Americans, made war on the Minnesota settlers. A campaign we call the U.S. Dakota War, which for a period of weeks actually through attacks and the burning of towns drove virtually all white settlers out of southern Minnesota for a period of weeks until the United States Army returned in force crushed the Dakota Rebellion against a U.S. authority and imprisoned thousands of Dakotas in an internment camp at Fort Snelling. The Ho-Chunk had played almost no role in the U.S.-Dakota War. A few Ho-Chunk people had sided with the Dakota. Others had studiously tried to stay neutral in the conflict. And at the end of the U.S.-Dakota War, when the United States Army subjected Ho-Chunk warriors, Ho-Chunk fighters, to summary trials as essentially as unlawful combatants, as people subject to drumhead trials lasting as little as 5 minutes, and sentenced more than 300 to die. President Lincoln commuted all but 39 of those sentences to life imprisonment, but on the day after Christmas, 1838, the United States executed 38 Dakota men at a mass gallows in Mankato, Minnesota, the largest mass execution in U.S. history to this day. It appears that no Ho-Chunk men were among those executed on that day, but in the aftermath of the U.S.-Dakota War and the mass execution of the Dakota and Mankato, settlers in Minnesota who had their eyes on the Blue Earth lands as well as on Dakota lands made the most of the anti-Indian hysteria among settlers and insisted that not only the Dakota should be forever banished from Minnesota, but that the Ho-Chunk should be as well. And so they were. And in legislation signed by President Lincoln in the spring of 1863, the Ho-Chunk were exiled from Minnesota to a barren camp out on the Missouri River called Crow Creek, a place where none of them wanted to live and very few could. Very quickly, under the leadership of Coming Thunder Winishek and others, the Ho-Chunk felled cottonwood trees that grew by the side of the river, forged dugout canoes that they were very familiar with making, and made their way down the Missouri River to lands held by their relations and friends, the Omaha people, where they made a home in 1865. And finally, in 1865, the federal government recognized and ratified that decision and transferred the Ho-Chunk people's title from the barren reserve at Crow Creek to a new reservation on the banks of the Missouri River in what was now the state of Nebraska. It's a torturous odyssey. At every stage of it, hundreds or more Ho-Chunk people die of disease, of starvation, sometimes at the hands of angry settlers and army officials. But at the end, this group of the Ho-Chunk people do reestablish themselves as a federally recognized sovereign nation and exist there today as the Winnebago tribe of Indians, which is a federally recognized nation of Ho-Chunk people in Nebraska. But that's only part of the story. At the other end of the diaspora, back in the Wisconsin homeland, is Roaring Thunder. Here he is represented first in the oil sketch made by the artist Charles Dease, who already knew about him in the early 1840s. He was kind of a famous roguish figure among Americans for his ability to resist the policy of removal. He did this oil sketch of him when he went to see him down on the Rock River in the winter of 1841, probably. When he got back to St. Louis, this didn't seem commercial enough, so then he dressed it up in this much more kind of Last of the Mohicans representation on the right here, much more romantic, but you can see that it's the same person. And you can see, too, that it's the same person here in this photograph taken at the Wisconsin Capitol in 1863. Because throughout that period, Roaring Thunder, Wakanja Hedega, was leading a campaign, a quiet campaign of resistance to removal by finding ways for Ho-Chunk people to reestablish their lives at the margins and at the interstices of the American settler grid, finding ways for them to interact with settlers when they were friendly and wanted to do commercial exchange and stay away from them when they were going to be a problem. By this time, the center of Ho-Chunk life had moved from the Rock River, from Dejoe, from other places in kind of south central Wisconsin, north of the Wisconsin River and up toward the Black River, which is today more like the homeland and the home of the Ho-Chunk Nation of Wisconsin. And in that territory, which was at the north or northwest periphery of settler settlement, there was room to do this. And there was hunting, and there was the possibility of maintaining a way of life. The Ho-Chunk in Wisconsin pursued many strategies to remain among the settlers. Commercial strategies, strategies of avoidance, and also, very interestingly, strategies of land ownership. The allotment by treaty is not the only way that Native people became landowners. This is a Ho-Chunk man, a Ho-Choga, or Blue Wing, who in the 1850s went to the General Land Office of the United States, like any other settler, and purchased land in Sauk County. You can see here that in this township, the person surveying the lands and marking what belongs to whom has marked this plot as belonging to Indian Ahachoga. And you can find plots like that on these plat maps throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century, clearly owned by Native people who got access to the land office because the policies weren't that clear, and managed to establish themselves as homesteaders on their own stolen land. Now, this raises the question, is this an example of Ho-Chunk people accepting the policy of civilization? Certainly, a lot of, that's what the land office wanted to see, that's what territorial officials wanted to see, that's what local settlers probably wanted to see. But in fact, what happens after Blue Wing buys this parcel of land is hundreds of Ho-Chunk people begin to move seasonally through it. It's got a spring, it's got resources, it's got game, it's got timber, it's got wetlands. Within the American grid, Blue Wing has reestablished a Ho-Chunk village, cordoned off by his property ownership of this parcel of land. And these Ho-Chunk villages persist. In fact, you might think that as settlers encroach on this land in the 1850s and 1860s, that they would have to flee. They'd have to move somewhere else. They do move somewhere else. They move closer to the town of Reedsburg because there are so many commercial interactions between Blue Wing and his village and the citizens of the growing town of Reedsburg that they're able to forge a kind of reciprocal relationship that doesn't threaten anybody's property relations. So there are lots of ways that Ho-Chunk people are finding ways to reestablish themselves or firm up their claim to be in the homeland. So by the 1860s and 70s, we have two big Ho-Chunk communities. We have the new community of the Winnebago tribe of Indians in Nebraska, and we have the folks who have never left the old homeland. But interestingly, we have a third group who represent a third strategy in this history. And that is the people who I mentioned briefly who have accepted allotment at Blue Earth in the early 1860s, who have taken up land, who have sent their children to the American school, and who in 1861 are able to say to the Minnesota settlers around them, hey, we're property owners, we speak English, we can do all the things you want us to do. We'll serve in the Union Army if you want. And they do. And are allowed to stay. And those that are kicked out are able to press their claims very quickly in Congress and get reparations for lands that have been taken away from them. So by the 1860s, we have three communities of Ho-Chunk people, representing three quite different strategies in response to American colonialism. But the late 1860s is not just a story of this history. The late 1860s is, of course, also the story of the post-Civil War era in the United States generally, and of the period in the process we call Reconstruction. And if you know anything about Reconstruction, one of the things you know is that it establishes the idea of national citizenship in the United States through the first clause of the 14th Amendment. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. Now, this was intended pure and simple to establish the national citizenship rights of former slaves and of African Americans generally as equal citizens of the United States, whom no state or local law or custom could deny. It was not aimed at Native Americans, and in fact, the language subject to the jurisdiction was thought to exclude virtually all Native people because they were thought to be under the jurisdiction of the nations that they occupied that had treaty relations with the United States and not the United States itself. But that, of course, was an imperfect sieve for capturing the experience of actual Native people. And in particular, if you think about the history I've just laid out for you, a very poor description of the status of the Ho-Chunk people. Because what about the Ho-Chunk people who had never left Wisconsin, who had never accepted their dispossession from their homeland, who had never followed Coming Thunder, Winneshiek, and the rest, and ended up in Nebraska in 1865? In what sense were they subject to the jurisdiction of the Ho-Chunk Nation? There was no plausible way to argue that they were. But on the other hand, where did they fit? Reconstruction is a moment that includes this enormous optimism about the possibility of a multiracial, multicultural United States with all kinds of different people living in a civic nation rather than an ethno-state, living together as equals around a common table, a table of brotherhood and sisterhood, in fact, in this. And in this cartoon, the artist Thomas Nast has represented a welter, not just of different European ethnicities, but also of Chinese and African American members of the American body politic, rendered respectfully, if in, to us, odd-looking terms, but not rendered as caricatures, not rendered with disrespect, not made undignified, intended to represent them as full and accepted members of the body politic. And everyone falls into that framework except this guy. What is this guy doing here? Not even Nast, the cartoonist, seems to know. And the question is, how far can Reconstruction's idealism stretch? And how far does the 14th Amendment stretch? How far does equal citizenship stretch? To some, it's actually quite obvious that it applies to them. Because to the people who have made their way to Blue Earth and remained there, have taken up property relations, have been accepted as members of American communities, they are very clearly subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. The only question is, how do they get recognized as citizens of the United States? They petition the Congress for recognition as citizens of the United States, and Congress responds with a quite extraordinary action and allows them to go to the courthouse, the federal courthouse at St. Paul in 1870 and 1872, and swear out naturalization papers as though they were immigrants to the United States. It's almost the same form that my great-grandparents filled out at Ellis Island about 30 years later. And in here you see a Ho-Chunk man named Peter Harrison being sworn in as a citizen of the United States with two other citizen witnesses attesting to his fitness for that status. Interestingly, both of them Ho-Chunk people who had been sworn in as citizens 2 years before. All of these strategies come together in the early 1870s as a movement to expel the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin surges up again. Local settlers, led by men like Andrew Jackson Turner, the historian Frederick Jackson Turner's father in Portage, insist that it's time for the Ho-Chunk to go once and for all. These relics of a barbarous age do not belong among civilized society, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And as they make that case, Ho-Chunk people in Wisconsin begin drawing upon the resources that they have gained through their many years of dealing with settlers in different ways, through their understanding of the power of property relations, through their knowledge of the naturalization process that has begun at St. Paul for some of their kin, and through their knowledge of all of the other frameworks and languages of Reconstruction citizenship that have entered the national discourse in the years since the Civil War. And in 1873, they send a petition to the federal government. It gets forwarded and forwarded and forwarded. It's been written down by a local lawyer in Portage named Henry Lee, and it contains a series of claims and statements on behalf of 240-some Ho-Chunk people, chief among them this. They further represent that they and each of them are sufficiently intelligent to control his own affairs, that they are willing and anxious to make homestead claims or to purchase real estate and adopt the habits and customs of civilized life and become citizens of the United States. This is not immediately popular in Congress, where Wisconsin's congressional delegation, all of them at that time Republicans, the party of Lincoln and the party that had prosecuted the Civil War and that was now prosecuting Reconstruction as a policy, were not happy about this. They too wanted to see the Ho-Chunk expelled from Wisconsin. And they were in the majority in Congress. They controlled the day in the late 1860s and early 1870s. But there were other voices in Congress. Not yet reactionary Southern voices, though those were returning and would return in short order, but reactionary Northern voices like this guy, Senator Alan Thurman, a Democrat from Ohio, a dyed-in-the-wool white supremacist, very open in his calls for race war anytime white supremacy was threatened, and very hostile on any number of grounds, both to African Americans and to Native Americans. Extremely hostile to the policy of Reconstruction and of non-racial equal citizenship. But more than anything else, hostile to the Republican lawmakers who were forcing that policy of non-racial equal citizenship upon him and upon white Southerners. And when he caught some of those Wisconsin Republicans trying to expel a non-white group who they found uncomfortable neighbors, he smelled a rat. He smelled hypocrisy, and he named it, and he shamed them. And he so embarrassed the Wisconsin Republicans on the floor of the United States Senate that when they did finally pass legislation that funded the expulsion of the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin in 1873, it contained a codicil that he had insisted on, which was that they were not allowed to use force to do it. They did. They lied, and they went ahead, and they got the Army to round up Ho-Chunk people in the winter of 1873 and 4. They captured 800 Ho-Chunk people across western Wisconsin and shipped them in boxcars to Nebraska in the dead of winter, and hundreds of people died. But they had done it against the law. They had done it without legal authorization. Thurman raised a ruckus in Congress. People on the ground soon realized that they did not have legal authority. When local settlers in Wisconsin objected to the expulsion of some of their Ho-Chunk neighbors, federal troops, so used to the struggle in Southern Reconstruction, wrote back letters like, "Are we allowed to shoot them?" And pretty soon the War Department and the federal administration decided, enough, stop. We don't have legal authorization to do this at all. And so all the Ho-Chunk people who'd been expelled to Nebraska begin trickling back, led sometimes by band leaders, sometimes by individual brave actors like this woman, Hotakawinga, Mary Crane, who led her family and others back from Nebraska to Wisconsin in the 1870s and 80s. In 1875, facing the return of virtually the entire exiled Ho-Chunk population of 1873, the federal government gives up, and it writes homestead legislation into a federal Indian Appropriation Act, allowing the Wisconsin Ho-Chunk to cash out of their tribal fund and buy homesteads in Wisconsin as citizens of Wisconsin. With that comes the right to purchase land, the right to vote in many instances for men, and the reestablishment of a Ho-Chunk presence, not in the entirety of their old homeland, but on individual homesteads that eventually become trust land and tribal-held land in today's Wisconsin. And though the story of the Ho-Chunk endurance over the next generations is itself extraordinary and would require many more talks of the length of this one to even scratch the surface of, the long and the short of it is the Ho-Chunk people are still here. all over Wisconsin and all over the region, representing themselves in powwows and as veterans and as members of Congress, with community centers and elder care and veterans care and casinos and shops and the beginnings of a mixed economy all across the Ho-Chunk homeland. Even on the UW-Madison campus now, we're beginning to acknowledge the fact that we are located on Ho-Chunk homeland, and that is a longer history by far than the history that we think of as the history of Wisconsin. The history of Dejope is more than 10,000 years old. The history of Madison and Wisconsin is barely 175. Here is our graduate student, Molly Paulette, a Ho-Chunk tribal member, who devised this incredible bit of beadwork, which has been reproduced as a banner now flying on the front of Bascom Hall. So Henry Dodge got it wrong. The Ho-Chunk were not doomed to be the relics of a barbarous civilization cast out and disappearing. They understood that the tools of the conqueror, land ownership, civilization, even citizenship, they could seize those for their own purposes. And to take this history seriously demands that we think about the nation's history from that perspective as well. And that the struggle of Native people is not something reserved for a small period in the 19th century. It's not a struggle that has ended. Is one that continues to this day in ways that are intensely meaningful for people's lives, even if most non-Native people never seen them, in matters as central to people's experience as tribal sovereignty and the adoption of children. If we understand Ho-Chunk history in this way, I think we have to understand U.S. history and North American history in a different way too. But this history is theirs, and this history too continues. Thank you.
You mentioned that the homestead was part of the reattainment, I guess you could say, of the land that they were getting. How big was the homestead purchases, and how many were they able to kind of coordinate?
In general, these purchases are 40 acres, but how many is a really, that's a more complicated question. Some people have done some research on this question, but we need a lot more. The Ho-Chunk Department of Cultural Resources has some information about that. But to go systematically through it and figure out who, over what period of time, purchased land between 1875 and the early 20th century, that's quite an undertaking. It's just for purposes of scale, you could think about the fact that we're talking about a population of about 2,500 people at the turn of the century. So we're not talking about an enormously large number of homesteads, right? Because these are family homesteads, but still enough to make it difficult to count easily.
I just got back from Bayfield, and I'm confused. What's the difference between the reservations that I was driving through, Bad River, all of that, to get back here, and the land purchases that the Ho-Chunk have done?
Yes.
Because they don't have a reservation, am I correct?
That's correct. The Ho-Chunk do not have a reservation. That is a really not unique but very unusual result. Most people who have retained the right to remain in their homeland have done so through reservations gained under treaties. But the Ho-Chunk, having lost the entirety of their homeland in earlier treaties, reassert a claim to it not as a reservation claim, but through individual property holdings that then later, some of which become recognized as either as trust land, which is a relationship between recognized tribes and the federal government, or as tribal land. And so this is a very unusual outcome. Almost everybody else in Wisconsin still or has a reservation based on 19th century treaties. Not Brothertown, but that's another story. But all the Ojibwe bands have those based on treaties really from the 1850s mostly, 30s, 40s, 50s. And the Ho-Chunk just have a very different arc through that struggle to remain here. That's what makes their story quite different than most of the other tribes in the state.
I noticed that the last map that you showed did in fact have a portion that's marked trust land.
Yep.
What was understood as trust lands at that time and what is understood as trust lands today?
So I'm actually not enough, I don't know enough Indian law to know when the trust doctrine becomes the basis for federal recognition of certain rights on certain lands. But in the present day, the trust relationship is a kind of a stewardship relationship between the federal government and tribal nations. That was not the case. That was not, in 1875, that was not the case with these lands. Because the Ho-Chunk, though they had the right to be in Wisconsin and were understood in some sense to be citizens or at least voters in Wisconsin, did not have federal recognition as a tribe, partly because they didn't have a reservation. They gained federal recognition as a tribe, regained federal recognition in Wisconsin based on the Indian Reform Act, the IRA of the New Deal era, but they take advantage of that 1930s legislation in the 1960s. So it's in the Kennedy administration that the Ho-Chunk turn one of their homesteads, and I used to be able to point out which one it was, but one of them gets named the sort of reservation homeland that becomes the basis for federal recognition, at which point they have written a tribal constitution. They rewrite that constitution in the 1990s and become the Ho-Chunk Nation of Wisconsin. But they gained federal recognition in the 1960s, finally. And I think it must only be at that point that these are recognized as federal trust lands, because without federal recognition, I don't think they could be.
In terms of census, how many Ho-Chunk would you say are in Wisconsin now?
So, this slideshow unfortunately doesn't have that document, but the Ho-Chunk do their own census, right? They have a full roll of everybody who's an enrolled member of the Ho-Chunk Nation of Wisconsin, and that includes, I don't want to misstate this, but it's about 7,500 people. That close. At least that was 2018, but it's in that ballpark. The Winnebago Nation of Nebraska, which is also a Ho-Chunk people, that's somewhat smaller in population. Not every enrolled member of the Ho-Chunk Nation of Wisconsin resides in Wisconsin. There's a whole district of their legislative system for people outside of the state of Wisconsin. It includes a bunch of folks in Twin Cities area and in Chicago area, but also in California and Texas and other places. So there's a sort of big Ho-Chunk diaspora. In fact, Sharice Davids here is a Ho-Chunk tribal member who is a representative from the state of Kansas. So Ho-Chunks are everywhere.
Thank you. I realize the Ho-Chunk don't have to tell us what their plans are, but do you have any sense for, do they have a plan for regaining more lands? And does that have anything to do with this casino down in Beloit?
So I don't know much about the casino in Beloit. I thought that might come up, but I have not had time to investigate that particularly. But the Ho-Chunk are always reacquiring lands. In fact, the biggest, most interesting developments that I'm aware of have been the Badger munitions plant. It's a super interesting story, right? Of the now President John Greendeer is sort of negotiating with the federal government years ago to try to work out that deal and work out that arrangement. And then the Kickapoo Valley Reserve and other places where, the principle of Ho-Chunk reacquisition of land is generally about stewardship. It's about figuring out how to reestablish certain kinds of tribal practices, cultural and agricultural practices on that land to make use of resources. There are Ho-Chunk traditions and crafts that are threatened by climate change, for example. Black ash baskets, which Ho-Chunk people have been making and selling to tourists since at least the 19th century, and which as a craft tradition is much older than that. That was a mainstay of the Ho-Chunk economy in the 20th century. Tourists from Chicago would come up and buy these baskets, and they're really extraordinary pieces of art. My colleague Tom Jones at the university has been collecting them and is doing a whole book, photo essay and book about them. But the black ash is threatened by the emerald ash borer. Climate change is wreaking havoc on this entire ecosystem. And so preserving the natural resources and trying to find ways to safeguard the natural resources that are so central to their kind of cultural identity is really a big part of the practice of reacquiring land.
My question is, a lot of the pieces we're seeing is, what I'm curious about are kind of post-Reconstruction, pre-Jim Crow.
Okay.
Really kind of like use of taking a page book out of the South in order to establish things like slave patrols and then converting them into police departments. And I'm just wondering if you've done any research about how things like that have been established throughout the Midwest in order to kind of uphold and preserve some of these removal and oppression tactics.
Yeah. Oh, that's a big and hard and interesting question. Thanks for that. So what I will say is it is all too easy to romanticize the story I've just told you as simply a victory, right? It is a victory. There's no disguising that. But it is not only a victory, because the world that Ho-Chunk people end up in late 19th and 20th century Wisconsin, it remains the world that tried to expel them in 1873. It remains in many ways a very hostile place for them, a place in which they are not, by and large, landowners on land, but end up working as laborers on land that they had previously gained the entire fruit of. So if we just think about, say, a crop like cranberries, for example, in the mid-19th century, the cranberry bogs are all commons. Everyone is just picking the crop and doing with it what they will, including selling it. But as the land gets privatized, Ho-Chunk people move from people utilizing the resource to people being paid to harvest the resource for someone else and getting a day wage for it instead. Along with that, and along with those kinds of very subordinated labor relations, come, and the fact of their non-whiteness, right, comes enormous suspicion of their motives, of their capacity for proper behavior, the fearsome stereotype of the drunken Indian, like a whole series of kind of cultural expectations and subordinations that put Native people, including Ho-Chunk people, in a very tough spot at the turn of the century. It's not an accident that the turn of the century is the nadir not just of African American life under Jim Crow, but also of Native life. The Native population, by some counts, by the turn of the century has fallen to 250,000 across the entire United States. And many people looking at that say, what's next is extinction. Native people are simply going to vanish. That's obviously not what happened, right? But it's not an unreasonable fear to have in that moment that this could be the end, because the hostile and predatory forces are so intense. They don't look like the same. They're not the same as the forces in the Jim Crow South, because the population is different, the scale of the population is different, its historic relationship to systems of labor control is different. That said, it's a white supremacist social order. It's a reestablishment. Contra the image I showed you from Reconstruction, the turn of the century really works hard to reestablish the United States as a white republic. Woodrow Wilson, Princeton history professor, soon to be president of the United States, not only screens the movie Birth of the Nation in the White House, but writes a history book in which he says, essentially, that black Southerners kind of, maybe they didn't get what they deserved at the end of Reconstruction, but it was natural that white people would take it out of them when the real citizens got back in power. This is the world of the early 20th century, and the Ho-Chunk are living in that world too.
What is the definition of a mission
Of a mission? Well, mission has lots of different definitions, but an Indian mission in this case is usually a denomination or a church's kind of outreach agency. That said, that makes it sound very voluntarist. It's the policy of the federal government in about 1870 to, quote, civilize Native people, and to do that, Christian denominations are formally empowered to be the missionizing force on particular reservations. Begins with Quakers and Baptists and Catholics, expands to others as well. And in that case, a mission can be a quite powerful disciplinary force on a reservation when coupled with the fact that Indian language and religious practice are increasingly outlawed from the 1880s on. And Christianity is kind of the official expectation of the federal government as the natural direction of the policy of civilization. So that, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's a part of the story of mission that's relevant to this. Thank you.